In the year 2024, entire villages across Italy closed their primary schools because there were not enough children left to keep the classrooms open. This was not caused by war or disaster, but by a quiet absence that had built up over many years. That same year, fewer than 400,000 babies were born nationwide, the lowest figure since Italy became a unified country in the 19th century. And yet Italy was still a wealthy industrial nation. It exported luxury goods across the world, carried close to 3 trillion euros in public debt, and remained one of the largest economies in Europe. There was no crash. There was no moment of panic. Daily life continued as normal, but something fundamental had stalled. For more than 2 decades, income per person had grown only weekly, lagging behind almost every other major developed economy. Not collapsing, not rebounding, but drifting. Year after year, the future narrowed while the present remained intact. So how does a modern economy freeze in place without ever falling apart? And was the euro truly the turning point? Or was Italy already locked onto this path decades earlier, long before anyone noticed what was being lost? In the decades following the Second World War, Italy was a country in motion. Trains carried young workers from rural villages into expanding industrial cities. Factory floors ran late into the night. New apartment blocks rose beside older neighborhoods still marked by war. For millions of Italians, progress was not theoretical. It could be seen in wages, in household goods, and in the quiet confidence that life next year would be better than life this year. This transformation became known as the Italian economic miracle. Within a single generation, Italy moved from widespread poverty to industrial strength. Manufacturing expanded rapidly across the north. Italian products entered markets across Europe and beyond. Household incomes rose steadily. Social mobility felt achievable. Growth was not debated or questioned. It was lived. At the center of this success stood a flexible economic framework. Italy retained control over its national currency and used it as a primary adjustment tool. When production costs increased or competitiveness weakened, the exchange rate moved. Italian exports became cheaper abroad. Domestic employment was protected. Economic pressure was released without forcing deep internal change. In its early years, this mechanism was effective. It absorbed shocks and preserved social stability in a country still rebuilding itself. But over time, it did more than smooth outcomes. It reshaped expectations across the economy. Firms learned that survival did not require constant reinvention. When margins tightened, relief often arrived through adjustment rather than transformation. Workers learned that purchasing power would be defended through price-linked mechanisms rather than productivity growth. Political leaders learned that difficult reforms could be postponed because economic pain could be softened rather than confronted. Gradually, outward adjustment replaced inward change. Stability became the priority. Efficiency mattered less than continuity. Innovation was welcomed, but it was no longer essential. The system functioned reliably, but it stopped evolving. This created an economy that appeared balanced while relying heavily on a single lever. Inflation absorbed inefficiency. Currency movements masked weak productivity growth. Investment in technology, management, and organizational scale lagged behind countries that were modernizing more aggressively. The economy remained active, but its foundations were thinning. European integration transformed this environment. By committing to a shared currency, Italy entered a new economic regime. Exchange rates would no longer adjust to domestic weakness. Competitiveness would have to come from productivity, institutional quality, and the structure of the labor force. The system shifted from adjustment to performance. This change did not arrive as a dramatic rupture. It arrived as exposure. Italy did not enter the new framework empty-handed. It carried habits formed over decades. Expectations built during the miracle years did not disappear when the currency changed. The euro did not dismantle a strong structure. It revealed a dependent one. Growth slowed not because a tool was removed, but because alternatives had never been fully built. The miracle had generated momentum, but it had also delayed transformation. This historical context explains why stagnation emerged without a single defining crisis. The seeds were planted during success, not failure. And those seeds would later shape how firms organized, how workers planned their lives, and how the state responded to pressure. For much of the post-war era, Italian growth relied on adaptation rather than transformation. When pressure appeared, the system adjusted around the problem instead of changing within it. Costs rose, competitiveness weakened, and relief arrived through mechanisms that softened the impact. Over time, this shaped how firms understood success. Survival became the objective. Expansion became optional. Italy developed an economy dominated by very small enterprises. Most firms employed only a handful of workers and remained under family control across generations. This structure preserved craftsmanship, continuity, and local identity. It also imposed limits that accumulated quietly. Small firms struggled to invest in research, automation, and advanced management systems. They lacked the capital buffers needed to experiment, fail, and try again. As a result, productivity improvements arrived slowly and unevenly. Incentives reinforced this equilibrium. Remaining small reduced exposure to complex regulation and rigid labor obligations. Expansion increased risk without guaranteeing reward. Hiring additional workers often triggered rules that were difficult to reverse during downturns. Rational firms chose stability. The economy learned how to endure shocks rather than how to generate momentum. Management practices followed the same pattern. Leadership frequently remained within families rather than shifting to professional executives selected for performance and experience. Decisions favored continuity and control over experimentation and scale. Where other economies professionalized management, standardized processes, and optimized supply chains, many Italian firms preserved structures that had worked in the past. Familiarity replaced efficiency. None of this produced immediate decline. Output continued. Employment remained relatively stable. Italian products retained reputation and quality in niche markets, but efficiency stopped improving. Productivity flattened. Wages followed. Living standards stabilized instead of advancing. The economy remained active, yet underpowered. When monetary adjustment disappeared, these limits became visible. Firms that had relied on flexibility now faced competitors built for scale, technology, and organization. The gap widened quietly through comparison rather than collapse. Italy did not fall backward. Others moved forward. This explains why stagnation arrived without drama. The system proved resilient, but resilience replaced progress. And as this pattern settled in, another constraint began to tighten around the economy, one that no firm-level adaptation could offset. Economic growth ultimately rests on people. Workers create output. Consumers sustain demand. Innovators generate new firms and ideas. When the population that performs these roles begins to shrink, growth does not slow because of mismanagement or temporary shocks. It slows because the arithmetic itself turns against expansion. Italy entered this phase gradually, then unmistakably. Birth rates declined over many decades, but the decline accelerated as economic momentum weakened and uncertainty spread. Each year, fewer children entered schools. Fewer young adults entered the labor market. Fewer households were formed. At the same time, life expectancy continued to rise and the number of retirees expanded. The balance between contributors and dependents shifted steadily in one direction. This demographic structure placed immediate limits on growth. A shrinking workforce capped total output even when productivity improved. At the same time, an aging population increased demand for pensions, healthcare, and long-term care. Public spending rose automatically, not because governments chose expansion, but because obligations expanded with age. These pressures accumulated quietly and continuously, year after year. Italy relies on a pension system financed primarily by current workers rather than accumulated savings. When the working population was large and growing, this arrangement appeared stable. As the workforce contracted, the burden shifted onto younger generations. Contribution rates increased. Net wages stagnated. Hiring became more expensive. Firms responded by limiting expansion, relying on temporary contracts, or delaying investment, reinforcing the cycle. The demographic squeeze extended beyond public finances. Young adults faced high taxes, limited job security, and rising housing costs in cities where property ownership was concentrated among older generations. Household formation was delayed. Family plans were postponed. Fertility declined further. Each adjustment intensified the pressure already present. Over time, this dynamic formed a self-reinforcing loop. Fewer births reduced the future labor force. A smaller labor force increased the fiscal burden on those who remained. Higher burdens discouraged family formation and risk-taking. The loop tightened without a single dramatic turning point. Unlike recessions, demographic decline does not reverse quickly. Policies introduced today affect birth rates years later and labor supply decades later. Even successful interventions operate with long delays. By the time results appear, expectations have already adjusted downward. Firms plan for limited growth. Workers anticipate slower advancement. Governments budget defensively. This arithmetic explains why growth remained weak even during periods of relative stability. Productivity gains, where they occurred, were insufficient to offset a shrinking labor force. Consumption lagged. Investment hesitated. The economy continued to function, but the margin for expansion narrowed steadily. As demographic pressure intensified, it collided with another constraint. Even when people and capital were available, the system struggled to move quickly. The next limitation lies not in population, but in the pace and structure of the state itself. As firms remained small and the population aged, the speed of the state became decisive. In Italy, stagnation was reinforced by institutions that moved slowly in an economy where clarity and pace increasingly determined success. The challenge was not the absence of rules, it was their accumulation and the time they consumed. Modern economies depend on predictability. Contracts must be enforced before cash flow collapses. Permits must be issued within known and reliable windows. Disputes must be resolved while businesses still exist to benefit from resolution. In Italy, these basic functions often required patience, measured in years rather than months. The civil justice system illustrates this drag. Commercial disputes frequently extended over long periods. Delayed payments strained liquidity for suppliers and subcontractors. Investment decisions were postponed. Risk-taking declined. Over time, businesses adapted by avoiding situations that depended on formal enforcement. Survival favored caution rather than expansion. This environment reshaped economic behavior. Trust shifted away from institutions and toward personal relationships. Informal arrangements replaced formal contracts. While this could function within small networks, it did not scale. Large projects and external investors require legal certainty rather than familiarity. As uncertainty spread, capital sought environments where outcomes were faster and more predictable. Administrative processes reinforced the same pattern. Starting a business, expanding operations, or building infrastructure often required navigating multiple layers of approval across different levels of government. Rules changed frequently. Interpretation varied by region and by office. What was accepted one year could be questioned the next. For firms planning long-term investment, this unpredictability functioned like a persistent tax on time. Policy volatility added another layer of friction. Economic incentives were introduced, revised, suspended, and sometimes reversed within short periods. Instead of encouraging commitment, this instability rewarded delay. Firms waited, investors hesitated, opportunities were missed quietly rather than lost dramatically. The state had been designed to protect stability and social balance. Over time, it became a system that protected inertia. Each regulation had a rationale. Each safeguard served a purpose. Together, they formed a dense web that resisted adaptation. Reform carried political cost and administrative complexity. Adjustment slowed even as pressure increased. This institutional drag did not produce collapse. It produced immobility. The economy continued to function, but acceleration became increasingly difficult. Growth potential was constrained not by lack of talent or capital, but by friction embedded within governance itself. As demographic pressure tightened and institutions resisted change, one final constraint came to dominate the entire system. It did not arrive suddenly. It had been accumulating in the background for decades, shaping every economic decision from a distance. By the time weak productivity, demographic decline, and institutional drag converged, Italy had already lost much of its freedom to respond. Public debt did not create these pressures. It fixed them in place and narrowed the range of possible choices. For decades, borrowing accumulated during periods when growth appeared secure and financing felt manageable. As long as expansion continued, debt seemed tolerable. When growth slowed, the same stock of obligations began to weigh more heavily on every decision. A rising share of public revenue was diverted toward interest payments rather than future investment. Resources that could have modernized infrastructure, improved education, or supported innovation were used to service past commitments. Debt reshaped political incentives. Governments became cautious not because ideas were lacking, but because markets respond quickly to uncertainty. Any reform that threatened short-term stability risked higher borrowing costs. Higher costs fed directly back into public finances, further reducing room to maneuver. Over time, policy drift replaced policy ambition. This created a self-reinforcing cycle. Slower growth made debt heavier. Heavier debt discouraged growth-oriented decisions. Each turn of the cycle narrowed options further. Unlike a recession, this process did not end with recovery. It persisted through refinancing and delay, year after year. Membership in a shared currency intensified these constraints. Monetary policy was set for the region rather than the country. When conditions tightened, Italy could not adjust independently. Pressure had to be absorbed through fiscal restraint or structural reform, both politically difficult in an aging society. The margin for error narrowed as expectations hardened. The outcome was not imminent collapse. It was permanent tension. Policy became reactive rather than strategic. Decisions focused on avoiding disruption rather than building capacity. The economy continued to function, but acceleration became increasingly difficult. Debt acted as gravity. It did not pull suddenly. It pulled continuously. Each year, it bent choices toward caution and away from transformation. Over time, the accumulation of constraints turned stagnation from a phase into a condition. With this final mechanism in place, the structure of Italian stagnation comes fully into view. Growth did not fail because of one mistake or one crisis. It faded as multiple limits reinforced each other, leaving little space for escape. Italy's stagnation becomes clearer when placed beside other advanced economies that face similar pressures over the same period. Aging populations, globalization, technological change, and financial shocks affected many countries at once. The divergence did not come from destiny. It came from response. The United States followed a markedly different path. Productivity growth accelerated as firms scaled, digitized, and reallocated labor toward new industries. Capital flowed into technology and advanced services. Labor markets adjusted more rapidly, allowing workers to move between sectors. Immigration supported workforce size and flexibility. Growth created room to absorb shocks rather than amplify them. While inequality increased, output per person continued to rise, widening the gap with slower-growing peers. Germany confronted its own structural challenges, including demographic aging and the long adjustment after reunification. Yet it preserved momentum through industrial scale and continuous efficiency gains. Large firms invested steadily in automation, training, and export integration. Supply chains were embedded across Europe. Institutions prioritized predictability and coordination. Even when growth slowed, productivity continued to advance, sustaining competitiveness. Spain offers a different contrast. It experienced a severe collapse during the global financial crisis. Unemployment surged and output contracted sharply. The shock was painful, but it forced change. Labor markets adjusted, banks were restructured, firms reorganized and consolidated. Growth returned unevenly, but the system shifted. Crisis accelerated adaptation. Italy avoided this kind of rupture. Stability was protected, employment losses were limited, social cohesion was preserved, but avoidance carried a cost. Without pressure to reform, structural weaknesses remained intact. While others adapted through crisis or innovation, Italy adapted through delay. The consequences unfolded gradually. Young Italians entered a labor market defined by temporary contracts, slow advancement, and limited opportunity. Many chose to leave in search of prospects elsewhere. Those who stayed delayed independence, household formation, and family life. Consumption weakened as uncertainty spread across generations. Regional divides hardened. Northern regions remained connected to global production networks and export markets. Southern regions struggled to attract private investment and relied heavily on public employment. Infrastructure gaps widened. Economic divergence became geographic and persistent. Public services came under increasing strain. An aging population demanded more healthcare and pension spending, while the working population that financed those systems shrank. Fiscal pressure limited investment in education, infrastructure, and innovation. Trust in institutions weakened as performance lagged expectations. Political effects followed naturally. Frustration fueled volatility. Reform proposals encountered resistance from groups fearful of losing protection. Short-term relief competed with long-term adjustment. The system became harder to change precisely when change was most needed. International capital responded predictably. Investment favored environments with clear rules, scalable opportunity, and institutional speed. Italy remained attractive culturally and aesthetically, but economically cautious. Capital arrived selectively rather than transformationally. The outcome was stability without progress. Italy avoided collapse but paid with lost decades of growth. The cost was not measured in crisis headlines, but in opportunities never realized. With the comparison complete, the final question becomes unavoidable. If stagnation is not inevitable, what choices remain? Italy's stagnation is not irreversible, but reversing it requires confronting trade-offs that have been postponed for decades. There is no single reform capable of restoring growth on its own. Progress depends on alignment across productivity, demography, institutions, and fiscal policy, sustained consistently over time rather than announced once and forgotten. The first requirement is productivity. Italy must create conditions that reward scale, investment, and professional management. Barriers that penalize firm growth need to be reduced, not through sudden deregulation, but by making expansion predictable rather than permanently risky. Hiring should not lock firms into obligations that cannot be adjusted when conditions change. Access to capital must favor investment in technology, organization, and export capacity, rather than merely financing survival. Small firms need not disappear, but successful firms must be allowed to grow into national and global competitors. The second requirement is demography. No economy can expand indefinitely with a shrinking workforce. Policies that support family formation, affordable housing, and stable employment are essential, but their effects unfold slowly. Decisions about children are shaped years before births occur, influenced by job security, housing access, and expectations about the future. Because these levers operate with long delays, immigration becomes unavoidable in the short and medium term. Managed and selective inflows can stabilize labor supply, support tax bases, and slow the pace of population aging. Without this adjustment, demographic arithmetic overwhelms every other reform effort. The third requirement is institutional speed. Courts, permitting systems, and public administration must operate within timeframes that match modern economic life. Predictability matters more than perfection. Entrepreneurs and investors can adapt to clear rules, even demanding ones. They retreat from uncertainty. Reform in this area depends less on additional spending and more on execution, accountability, and consistency across regions. Fiscal policy sets the boundary for all other choices. High public debt limits experimentation, but it does not eliminate agency. Gradual reallocation from consumption toward investment can raise long-term capacity without destabilizing confidence. Credibility is built through repetition rather than rhetoric. Markets respond not to promises, but to sustained behavior over time. From these choices emerge two plausible futures. In one path, reform proceeds slowly but persistently. Productivity improves modestly. Demographic decline stabilizes. Growth remains limited but positive. Italy preserves social cohesion while rebuilding economic capacity over a generation rather than a single political cycle. In the other path, adjustment continues to be avoided. Demographic decline accelerates. Debt grows heavier. Institutions resist change. The economy continues to function, but opportunity narrows further. Stability persists, but progress fades. The country becomes wealthier in memory than in reality. The difference between these paths is not ideology. It is endurance. Reform is not a moment, it is a commitment measured in years. Italy did not arrive at stagnation through a single error or a sudden shock. It arrived here through accumulation. For decades, adjustment replaced transformation. Flexibility postponed reform. Firm structures limited scale. Demographic decline tightened the arithmetic of growth. Institutions slowed response. Debt narrowed choice. Each constraint reinforced the next until stability became routine and progress became rare. This is why Italy feels frozen rather than broken. Daily life continues. Exports persist. Culture remains vibrant. The country still appears wealthy by many measures. Yet the future grows thinner each year. The cost of stagnation is not collapse. It is time. Time lost to postpone decisions. Time lost to opportunities that never formed. Time lost by younger generations who wait or leave. The lesson extends beyond one country. Aging societies across the developed world face similar pressures. Incentives shape outcomes. Structures outlast slogans. Growth is not guaranteed by history, reputation, or past success. It must be rebuilt deliberately, patiently, and consistently. Understanding these mechanisms matters, not to assign blame, but to clarify choices. Economic systems rarely fail loudly at first. They fade quietly. Only those who understand how the fade happens can change the direction before it becomes irreversible. If this analysis helped clarify how stagnation takes hold and why it persists, share it with others who care about the future of advanced economies. And if you want to continue exploring how money, institutions, and incentives shape nations over time, stay with the series. Understanding the system is the first step toward changing it.